Welcome to the Social Learning Amplified podcast, the podcast that brings us candid conversations with educators who are finding new ways to engage and motivate their students inside and outside the classrooms. Let's meet today's guest. Welcome everyone to a very special live recording of the Social Learning Amplified podcast, coming to you from the Perusall Exchange 2026. The theme of this year's exchange is assessment in the age of AI, and now I cannot imagine three better guests to help us navigate this landscape. They are the authors of the highly anticipated book, The Norton Guide to AI-Aware Teaching, forthcoming from Norton this July. Now, before we dive in, I have a very exciting announcement. All three of our guests today will be leading our Perusall Engage event starting on July 6th. If you're not familiar with Engage events, they are author-facilitated communal reading events where you not only get access to their new book, but you will also engage in sort of the very AI-aware social learning that we're discussing today. So be sure to register for this unique event. Now, let me introduce our panel. Annette Vee is an associate professor of English at the University of Pittsburgh and author of Coding Literacy. She's a leading voice on what AI means for writing and computation. Marc Watkins directs the AI Institute for Teachers at the University of Mississippi. He's the pioneer of curious skepticism in the AI classroom. And Derek Bruff is the Associate Director of the Center for Teaching Excellence at UVA and host of the excellent Intentional Teaching podcast. Annette, Marc, Derek, welcome, and thank you so much for joining me today.
We're very glad to be here, Eric.
Well, good to see you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yes, very excited to have the conversation today.
I'm looking forward to it. So let's dive right in. Annette, your book uses the phrase AI-aware teaching, not AI integrated, and certainly not AI resistant. Why was awareness the right word for this cultural moment?
Well, so first of all, AI awareness means paying attention to the landscape. And the landscape means both what our students are doing currently with AI, what AI is doing, and what our pedagogical goals are. And I think that's actually kind of the only way we can do it, right? We can resist within that framework and we can engage within that framework. It kind of encompasses all of those things. And I think that many instructors at this point are kind of doing some combination of those things. And so when we were thinking through, if we were going to do a guidebook, what does it look like? There are things out there that really help folks try to resist AI, and there are other things out there that help folks try to engage with AI, but we really wanted to kind of keep the center on the pedagogy and how we navigate across those things. And that, to me, is what AI awareness is in terms of teaching.
And Marc and Derek, does being aware mean we have to change our goals or just change our assignments?
I think it means we have to question a lot of different things, including our goals and our assignments and our assessment approach. One thing that awareness means to me is agency, both for myself as a teacher in the classroom, but also for my students. I want them to make intentional decisions to use or not use AI too, and advocate for those reasons why that's the case. And for myself as a teacher too, I want to model that type of behavior about transparency and disclosure if I'm using AI. And hopefully they're going to pick up on some of these cues as well from me too, that are both intentional for my own syllabus, but also when I label material too that has AI into it for them as well.
Yeah, I think we have to change assessments. I think that's where a lot of this conversation around AI started. But people of all professions are using AI in interesting, clever, terrible, ugly, useful, weird ways, right? It's changing how we communicate. It's changing how we understand knowledge. And I think, we all have a role to play in helping our students navigate that. And so, yeah, maybe that's saying to our students, you know what, we're gonna learn how to learn without AI. We're gonna do things in a distraction-free, tech-free way because there's value in that. It could also mean I need to prepare you for the profession that you're entering in, where you need to use these tools ethically and effectively. And so we're going to make AI competencies squarely in our list of learning objectives. Um, we try not to prescribe, like that's going to depend on you and your goals and your students and your context, right? There's a lot of it depends in there. But I think we have to make those choices, and we have to figure out what do those high level choices mean for the course design that we do.
So, I mean, AI, it's interesting to listen to you describe that, Derek. I mean, and if I think about it, our students are going to enter, a workplace that involves AI. And there's no question about it. AI, in fact, maybe we should really start by thinking, what is AI going to do to the workplace and society before considering what to do in education in some sense, right? Because ultimately, we're preparing our students for, their future careers. So wouldn't it be best to encourage faculty to embrace AI and to, support the learning and the development of, to use your word, AI aware skills?
I think we want to be careful a little bit about, just preparing our students for the workplace. I mean, a college and, higher education does so much more than that. So that's certainly, I think, part of the landscape that we need to take into account. What are our students going to do afterwards? But there's a difference between workplace training and most college classes, and that is that we need to kind of engage with our students' developments. And one of the things that I think really matters for that is focusing on critical inquiry. I'm contrasting that to critical thinking, which I think is also important, right? But critical inquiry is the kind of like, what are the interesting questions that students are asking? What is their motivation? What's driving them? And I think that's, when we look at the kind of reshaping of higher education into a more utilitarian, you just get your title, you just get your degree, and then you move on. Like, this is the kind of stuff that is making students make bad choices about AI. That if we think of it as simply a hurdle that they need to get through, if they're thinking about that, then this is how they're using AI in negative ways, right? Shortcutting their education. And so I think, part of our approaching higher education now in the context of AI is thinking like very carefully about those pedagogical goals, and they might include workplace kind of preparation, but they're also going to include a lot of really important things about students' development.
I'll add to that because I think sometimes you hear people say, "Oh, higher ed is not about preparing for the workplace, and therefore I don't have to pay attention to AI." But I don't think that's a good argument, right? I think, as I said, AI is changing how we communicate, how we encounter information, what sense we make of the world, right? In our jobs and in other parts of our lives, right? I think it's changing how students are learning as they use these tools as learners. And there's productive ways to use them and unproductive ways to use them. And I think those are places where our students need our guidance, even if we're not thinking about kind of jobs down the road, but how do we make sense of information? How do we learn, right? What are the skills and the approaches and the tools we need to learn well? I think most of us can see ourselves teaching to that.
Marc, as a skeptic, what do you have to add to that?
Well, I'll try to draw on some concrete details too that we included in the book too. We crowdsourced many different examples from our own teaching, but also from faculty across the United States and even internationally. One example that I found that is wonderful comes from Maggie Boyd in Boston University. Her team put together an activity called Pause Before You Prompt, which asks students to think reflectively and critically about why they're going to an AI tool in the first place. Not only is it looking at the output and the bias that might happen in the actual generative version of that, what's drawing you to this? Are you trying to spend time to develop your own learning skills with AI? Or are you just trying to pass off the work too because you feel too overwhelmed? Those are all big questions that are going through our students' minds. The big thing I'm thinking about this as a skeptic is one thing that I'm looking at this from our what we've done with the book too, is inviting both faculty and students to kind of slow down and consider what this tool is doing, which offers a very much so a frictionless, very efficient answer to many different questions we'd ask it to, and begin to critically kind of engage with that too, and think about those choices too. Go back to what I first said too. It's going to all be about agency and what we're doing with this technology.
Before we go on, I want to remind the audience to use the Q&A box for questions you want me to ask our guests here today, and to use the chat to ask any other questions to each other or about logistics and so on. As I was listening to what Marc was saying, Derek, I was reminded about something that you may be familiar with, because if I recall correctly, you were a math major at Harvard, right?
Sort
And you
of.
may,
I taught math there for a couple of years. Yeah.
exactly. And you may recall that in the mid 90s there was this whole back and forth, because of the calculus reform movement and the graphing calculator, right? Should we continue to teach students to plot functions by hand because that's such a valuable skill, pardon me, or should we embed graphing calculators and, let students build upon that skill that can now be automated and learn more about the interpretation of graphs and understanding, derivatives and integrals and so on. We're sort of a little bit at the same, on a much broader scale, of course, and at the same point with AI, and not, but the thing that's different is that with AI we can't look forward into the future, but with the calculator we can look back into the past. And I think now everybody has sort of accepted, the existence of the calculator and realized, oh, it's much better to use that tool and to get skills, to develop skills in students that are higher than just simply plotting a function by hand. Do you think that this is a valid parallel?
Well, what I'll say that some of my math colleagues are still warming up to the idea of calculators in math education. So I don't know that we've quite cleared that hurdle entirely.
But
Also,
much more than
much more, yes.
Than the fist fights that were breaking out
Right.
in the mid
Right.
90s.
Well, and every time I go for the calculator comparison, I get someone angry. So I'm just going to expect that in the chat here. But
That's fine.
But so there's a couple of angles on this comparison. One that I think is kind of what you mentioned about the fistfights, right? So the fact that this technology entered math education meant that math educators had to grapple with what we need to be teaching students. And does that need to change? And I think that's true for AI as well. Are there places, are there fields, are there areas, is there kind of bodies of knowledge or skills where we actually do need to update what we're teaching and teach something different because these AI tools are available to students? I'm not saying that that's across the board, but I'm saying that the comparison is we have to grapple with that. We have to decide that. I think the other piece of that is what skills do our students need? What mindsets do they need if they are going to use these tools well? Right? Can they evaluate the output and say, I think that actually does make sense? That's something we would do with graphing calculators. We would want students to be able to kind of know what buttons to press, and we would want students to evaluate the output and say, is this reasonable? Is this plausible? Right? Have maybe I done something wrong here? There's lots of other places where the metaphor breaks down, certainly, but thinking about the kind of prerequisite knowledge that students might need to use these tools well and effectively and critically, like Annette was saying, I think is part of that mix. And I think it took math educators a while to figure out how to teach that too, right? So it's okay that this is hard. We're figuring this out together.
And, of course, calculators did not have, as somebody in the chat just noticed, did not have the same social and economic impact that AI is.
Absolutely. Yeah.
They also didn't try to validate you every time they answered your question.
I know.
Good idea.
And ask you to carry out another calculation.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
This is the best calculation in the history of the world. Please tell me more.
But I also have to share, like I took calculus in high school. I had a really great high school teacher, Diane Steelman in South Carolina, and we had graphing calculators, and she had a way of helping us understand the concepts through our use of the technology, right? It wasn't It wasn't, can we do calculus with a calculator? Can we use a calculator to help us understand calculus? And that's a subtle change, but I think it's an important way that we can also look at AI
Yeah,
in some cases.
absolutely, absolutely. And you know, in that respect, I want to sort of shift the focus of our conversation a little bit and go towards, you know, AI-aware assessment. But before I do so, I want to talk about something that I think is becoming increasingly important, and it's actually been a thread through my own uh, pedagogical journey, and that is that now it's more important than ever that we make thinking visible. Right? In other words, it's not the end product, it's not the answer, it's how you get there. And in fact, anything in society, usually the answer is known or obvious, but the path to the outcome, the desired outcome, is not obvious. So we really should train students on process and on thinking rather than just producing some kind of an artifact. And you know, that was, in a sense, that was my goal when I introduced peer instruction back in, wow, 35 years ago, 1991, right? It was really to make thinking visible. So now we have AI that can easily produce a polished final product, you know, a derivation, an essay, whatever. So do you think that means that we should stop assessing the product and start assessing the process of learning instead? Let me rephrase that question. I'm quite sure you probably will be leaning toward that because that's what we are about as educators. The big problem is, how do you scale that up? Right? Why are we looking at the outcome? Why are we looking at the answer? Because it's really easy to do when you have 500 students.
Yeah, the labor involved in all this is massive. The labor
It is
in just
massive.
responding to this too. And you know, part of it's the material conditions of the buildings we work in too. It's very difficult to have active learning in a lecture hall where your students can't even turn their chairs more than 180 degrees in some cases. So you really have to work with what you have and think about that. But I am very much so about process-based, right? That Annette and I are both writing professors too. We work within the fields of rhetoric and English. So we are really, I think, attuned to the fact too, when AI first appeared, especially generative AI, like we're talking about here, there was no longer going to be the terror of the blank page for students. And a lot of that thinking, a lot of that sort of decision making happened in that rough draft. So we are looking at a lot of different strategies people have done to preserve the rough draft, that process as much as possible. Mark Morano does a sort of analog sandwich exercise a semester long with his students too. He has them not write in blue books, because I'm not a fan of blue books either too, but in a notebook for half the semester. So it's very analog and the readings are all printed out. But then after that midway semester point two, he shifts to a digital format too. So students can actually have access to whatever tool they want, whether it's generative AI or a word processor, to complete their assignments. And he's asking them to critically think about what this is doing to their process. And Derek has interviewed colleagues at UVA too, have gone back into analog methods too. They don't always have to be pen and paper. You can have them write with a laptop in the classroom or do other types of activities in the classroom too. As Derek will note too, they can turn their word processor into deep focus mode. They can turn off their Wi-Fi. It's not an all or nothing situation. We can look at these different strategies to think about how we can preserve learning using some analog techniques by also inviting them to explore some different digital strategies too. And I think that's the sort of pathway I'd like for us to consider. We just have to get out of this sort of all or nothing sort of idea too with AI to get there.
And I think
go ahead.
yeah, I mean, one of the things I just want to emphasize what Marc is saying too, underneath that is each of these moments is like a deliberate orientation to AI is chosen and discussed with the students. So, you know, and as a teacher, you can choose, but, you know, we have somewhat limited agency, as I'm sure many people in this call have noticed. Like, you can say, don't use AI, and students may or may not follow that. But the deliberate choice and then making sure that that choice matters and means something and that students get something out of that, I think is really crucial. So I'll just throw in another example is the PAIR project that's coming out of UC Davis, which is really wonderful in terms of thinking about intentionality between when you work with AI and when you work with peers. And it's also breaking down the process. So Eric, when you're saying, should we be assessing the product or the process? Like really, it should be both. But in the process, like how do we help students like walk through these different parts of the process and then make sure that they're making kind of good decisions about AI throughout this process. So the pair process it's a peer review process that for papers, and it doesn't necessarily have to be in composition classes or anything like that. And it starts with peer review, like human peer review, and there's reasonings for that. They have all sorts of resources. And then it moves to AI review, and they have it set up through My Essay Feedback, and there's prompts, and the peer team has beautiful resources for this. And then students have to like reflect and figure out those different kinds of feedback, talk back to them, etc. And so there's a lot of metacognition that's happening in that process. They're thinking very carefully about, because one of the things we notice with students is that if they're getting feedback on their writing, which I do, I think many of us do at this point, a lot of times students will default to a kind of one and done, like I'm just giving it to AI and I'm going to get an answer, right? But if they're going to use AI, we want them to do it in a kind of iterative, critical thinking, critical inquiry sort of way, in which case it's usually going to mean a kind of back and forth process where they're pushing back, where they're thinking carefully about, what they're integrating, things like that. And that's a beautiful way that AI can be used for students' development. And the pair process does a really nice job of that. But Mark Marino's work and the analog sandwich, there's a lot of different examples that we have in the book that of teachers doing that in really good ways.
I actually think that peer and self-review is becoming really, really important, and there's one solution to scaling up because you in a sense you bring in everybody in the review and feedback process, and I tend to think that feedback is more important than the scores. So what I've been doing, because I have quite a bit of writing in my course as well, is I use calibrated peer review as a feedback cycle. So they go through a calibration phase, then they look at 3 anonymous peers, and then they look at themselves, by which time they've seen a huge spectrum of different pieces. And then they have to hand in a revision, which I provide feedback on. So, by the way, did any of you see this tool that works with Google Docs called Revision History?
Mm-hmm.
I do, yeah. I actually have it loaded.
What do you think of it? I was blown away when I saw it, because you can actually see the process of writing revealed. What are your thoughts about it?
It's an amazing thing. I have to say, like, it can be really good. The thing that I think we want to be careful of is like not using that for surveillance. It should be, if we're going to use it, it shouldn't be as a policing technology, but it should be as a way of showing how writing is taught. So when I've shown that with my classes, one of the things that I've done is taken a document that I've edited and written and shown them, here's what it looks like. And, a lot of times our students, if they're writing, they're writing from top to bottom, and they think, well, if I'm having difficulty at any point, then there's something wrong with me. That's the point where they start to turn to AI. They feel that friction, that difficulty of learning, and they may turn to AI in sort of negative ways at that point. But I'm a fairly expert writer at this point, and if you see my editing, it's like, here's notes, here's like half-formed sentences, here's a paragraph that I move over here, here's a deletion, here's me, talking to myself about how dumb that paragraph is. There's like a lot happening there. And I think that's actually really important, when we talk about process, to have students see that process for people who are experts, for their peers. Eric, you're talking about that with the social annotation with Perusall, which I think is helpful, right? Like they can see other minds at work, and it helps them kind of normalize difficulty and help them kind of, realize that they're learning in community.
I want to highlight a couple of kind of not quite recipes, but I don't know, templates that we talk about in the book. So the analog sandwich is kind of a version of what I would call a red light, then a green light assignment, where you tell students not to use AI for the first portions, maybe for the brainstorming, the ideation, the drafting, but they can use AI later in strategic targeted ways. The pair project is a nice example of that. And I think one of the advantages of that is that you are bringing the AI use out into the light. You're having a conversation about it with your students, which I think is an important part of AI-aware teaching. And I think some students are okay. They're less likely to kind of shortcut via AI in the early stages if they know they'll have a chance to use AI later in some more thoughtful ways, right? And so it helps students kind of resist the temptation early on. I'd also say that I think the metacognitive reflection is also an important part of the processes that we develop for students. I have a colleague at UVA, Kira Allison, who teaches a communications course, and she has her students do something she calls a Mission Impossible persuasion task, right? Do some kind of persuasive task that you never thought you could do before, but see if AI can help you do it. And what I like about this is that she has students, before they start, plan out how they think they might use AI to do this. And then they document how they use AI as they're doing the work and preparing. And even when they present out to the class, it's like a public speaking class, part of their presentation is how they used AI and where it was helpful and where it wasn't. And so I think that is really important for students. Again, it helps to bring the AI use out in the light, and it helps to take this struggle that students experience between getting help from AI and getting too much help from AI. And it helps them reflect on that and it gives us a chance to speak into that a little more.
I see here a question that has been upvoted 14 times, so it's time to address it, I guess. Brian Dunst is asking, I work at a community college and students have begun to overwhelmingly prefer online asynchronous courses. Colleges are also currently facing the quote unquote enrollment cliff, which makes them reticent to push back against consumer preferences, which means the pedagogical environment higher educators are facing in this online space where the choice seems to be between policing, surveillance, having an oppositional relationship with students versus struggling with the influence of generative AI being used to being used contrary to the spirit of learning. Could the panelists speak to this bind?
Yeah, I can take that question. It is deeply unfortunate to see how very much so exposed asynchronous online learning has been to AI. I teach asynchronously online too. We are at a residential college here at the University of Mississippi, but we also are seeing students prefer asynchronous classes, even when they're physically here on the dorms, which is just wild to me to think about. I'm in my office right now. I'm 150 yards from the nearest dorm. I could, in theory, be having a class with students never seeing their faces live from this sort of dichotomy too. So I do think this is something we want to start reconsidering. I am in no way saying we have to do away with online learning too. I think it's an accessibility issue too. I think it's also going to be an issue too about getting students involved with it. I think we can change how we go about process these different materials. My online discussion board is no longer text-based. It has been video-based now for a while. It's no longer just the talking head like you see us doing right now too. I'm having my students share their screen, and when they're working on a project too, that project is shared with them. They're going through, just like a social annotation would be asynchronously, they're doing this live in that discussion, recording that, and then they're going to interact with each other. That's one version of it too. For those readings too, Perusall is a wonderful tool that we've used before in the past too, and continue to do too, to encourage that. The whole concept of this, though, is that we want to be really aware of the fact, too, that if we don't have a good relationship for our students, if we don't have consistent FaceTime in some way, shape, or form, that it is really inviting them to kind of automate that process, especially with different new AI agents that are out here, too. One bit of good news, and Anna Mills was actually just talking about this on LinkedIn, too, is that Amazon has successfully sued Perplexity AI for their Comet browser to block them from using it within their system. It's not in your LMSs yet, but it is based off of a user's login. So that is giving me some hope too that we might see some actual legal action too that might block our learning management systems from being invaded by these agentic browsers, which is very difficult for me to see them being pedagogically sound for that sort of method of using this type of tools.
I'd like to add to that, and I think I looked into this when we pivoted online in 2020, that there are examples of extremely successful online educational programs that have dealt with these problems of assessment and accountability, but also how to keep students engaged. And I'm just going to mention two two examples on sort of almost opposite ends of the educational spectrum. One is the Minerva University, which has a residential program with students sitting, near each other, but the education is completely online because they're globally they go from one city to another around the globe, and the instructors don't travel with them. So their social program is, live in person, but their learning program is on this platform called Forum, where you can't even turn off your video. You have to participate. Which has a complete assessment tool built into the video platform. It's very impressive. And on the other hand, of course, at a much larger scale is Western Governors University, which has taught online for a very, very long time and dealt with many of the issues that I think AI is all of a sudden bringing to the forefront. Annette, in writing, the struggle is often where the thinking happens. You already alluded to that. So how do we, I don't know if you heard my podcast with Flower Darby, where she talked about keeping the fizz in education. So how do you keep the fizz in writing when a bot can do the heavy lifting?
This is the question that every writing class has to answer right now, which is why write when AI can do it? And I think that teachers need to engage with that question, but they also need to help students answer that question. Like, ultimately, we are not going to get through this by just policing and shaking our fingers at students and saying, what they should be doing, right? Like, they have to be involved in it in some way, and they have to feel like their education matters. So, I think, one of the things that I think is really important, we talk about this in the book, is, some of the generic advice for AI is, it's great for brainstorming. You can kind of get ideas from AI, et cetera. I think this is absolutely the wrong way to go. I think that it's better to use AI on the back end of some writing versus on the front end. And so we have lots of examples of writing teachers doing that. And that includes, like, if you're resisting AI, like, if you can't fit the entire paper in a class, like, what you do is you start out with students, like, brainstorming in class, thinking on paper or in focus mode on their laptops or whatever. Because what happens when students are using AI's ideas is that they don't feel that same kind of attachment. They see those ideas, they think potentially they're better than their own ideas, right? And they start to kind of, second guess their ideas and their own creativity. And Ethan Mollick calls this anchoring. So if you start with that kind of idea from AI, it's very difficult for students to deviate from that and to come up with new ideas after that. Whereas if they start with their own ideas, you get much more of a diversity of those ideas. And there's a great article by Piers Gelly in LitHub a couple of years ago where he talks about using ChatGPT to replace him, and it's a great article. But one of the things that he does that I think is like such a great teaching move is he's received all of these papers where students have kind of written generic things, but what he realizes is that, back to the social conversation that we were talking about, is that students, they thought those ideas were interesting when they turned them into him, but the students didn't see each other's papers. They didn't see them as a whole, right? And so what he did then is have students read aloud the titles of each of their papers, and all of their titles were Navigating the Digital Age, AI, and, whatever. And as they read through all of these papers, there was a kind of realization from the students that their ideas are super generic, right? So I think that, convincing students that your ideas are interesting, I'm interested in your ideas, I want to hear from you, those kinds of things are really important. And, the other thing I'll just add quickly is that I've done a lot of empirical research on students and why they use AI and why they don't use AI. And the top reason why they're not using AI, why they turn away from it, why they decide not to use it, is because they value their own originality. And I think that that's really crucial for us to lean into. You can have original ideas, working in conjunction with AI, but I do think that kind of, that's where the fizz is for students, right? And I think for writing that matters.
So I've recently moved towards ungrading this semester for the first time. I went during the pandemic, I shifted to specifications grading, and then I've had a number of guests on my podcast talking about ungrading, and I thought, can I do this? Can I do it? Ideally, I'd like to go to a completely narrative evaluation, but I've moved to this ungrading this semester. And I wrapped up my course, and I'm quite happy about the results because I believe that really motivation is the key to stopping students from outsourcing their work to AI, right? I mean, if you focus on the learning, and all human beings are essentially wired to learn. I mean, we all are born constantly asking the question why, and in a sense, it's beaten out of us. Right. But if you own the learning, then you won't want to skip it. So does your book suggest that the AI-aware teacher also needs to be an assessment-aware teacher? In other words, can we have AI awareness in a high-stakes 100-point grading skill system?
That is a wonderful question. And I have some wonderful colleagues here too, Emily Donahoe and Josh Eiler, that are really wonderful experts in alternative grading strategies. I've been using a version of labor-based grading since probably 2019 in my classes. It is high contact, and that's kind of how we're teaching our courses too, because it's low enrollment. For a high enrollment class too, you do have to think about that. You also have to think about students' perceptions of grades too. One of the interesting things that I've seen from students too is some of them have panic attacks when you tell them you're not going to be using grading, just feedback. And I've had to sit down with some students in my office, like say, well, look, you need to tell me what my grade is. I have to know. I'm like, you have literally glowing feedback from me this entire semester. It's like, you're not an A or a B, you're a person. And this student was just like, just tell me if I'm A or B. And we just have to kind of navigate that this has been instilled in them too, and give them that process. But I think the sort of giant umbrella that this all falls under too is there's so many different ways we're going to have to rethink and reevaluate how we teach, how we assess learning. And we have options, which is a wonderful thing to have too. The challenge is no one's going to tell you you have to do this. You're going to have to come to that on your own accord too. And you're going to have to think about your own capacity, your own resources, and your support that you have from your department and from your school to do so. You can tell your provost, I'll probably get some wonderful letters about this. I very much so believe that if you are non-tenure track faculty, you should still also have course releases and things like sabbatical to help you teach, not just about AI, but to help you teach in general. And this is a wonderful opportunity for us to make that labor necessary visible to upper administration to get some of those resources.
I think it's time for another audience question here. Eric Grunwald is asking, one impact of AI that seems to be emerging is that for novices, AI often leaves users with the illusion of mastery, whereas for expert, it serves as a real accelerator, thus hinting at a new kind of divide. Any ideas on how we can show that danger to students as a motivator and then to enable them to be in the latter category?
I'll jump in there because I was thinking about a question or a comment you made earlier about large classes, and I was trying to think, like, where do I see AI showing up in large classes? And so for a lot of my colleagues in the sciences and mathematics, they're thinking about how can we create a custom AI chatbot that will be a better tutor for students. A lot of the AI chatbots are not like when you log on to ChatGPT, it's not designed to help you learn, right? It's designed to answer your questions and give you the feeling of fluency and ease, right? And that's actually not that's not how learning works. And so I think my answer is how can we find ways to help students see the kind of the flaws in the easy fluent learning and shift them towards if they are going to interact with AI, to do it in ways that are informed by what we know about how learning actually works, right? That we kind of lean into the desirable difficulties of learning. Some faculty are sharing prompts with students. So here's a prompt that will get your AI chatbot to act like a student. And now your job is to teach the student what you know, and it's going to give you feedback on that, right? That's a different way of using the AI. Some prompts are there to have the AI generate practice questions for you, so you can do some retrieval practice, right? That's a more learning science informed way of interacting with an AI. And as I said, some faculty are trying to kind of build that into their tutor bots that they're designing, so that they're kind of shaping these AI bots that will behave more like tutors and less like the kind of answer machine that ChatGPT presents itself as. Because I think that idea that I was talking to educational researcher Leon Furs recently, and he said, if there's one thing we can have students unlearn is that it's not Google. It looks like Google. It's a little box and it's going to answer all your questions, but that is not a helpful way to use AI in most cases. We need other mental models of what you can do with these tools that actually do contribute to your learning and not give you this kind of fake feeling that you've mastered something. It's Eric, like you talked about years ago, right? Like I show up to your class, you lecture for 50 minutes. It all makes sense when you say it, right? But that doesn't mean it's in my head. And so AI is doing that same kind of thing, and we've got to find some structures to shift students away from that.
Yeah, I'm also thinking more and more that AI devalues artifacts. I mean, if you think about assessments, they fall, as I heard recently expressed by one of my podcast hosts, Janik Jerio, fall into two buckets. There's the performance bucket and there's the artifact bucket, right? So an essay, a homework, a problem set, even a project itself, they're all artifacts. A performance would be an oral exam or a musical performance or a theater play or an oral justification of an artifact. And I think that AI, in a sense, forces us more and more towards that performance bucket to make things to make things more insightful into what goes on in the head of the student. And I think the big question is how can we scale that up? Because most problems seem to be occurring in larger classes. So
well, I just want to jump in because one of the things that was fun writing this book is that we have a chapter on the kind of authentication of student learning, academic integrity issues, and I kind of halfway
that falls into policing, right?
Right.
Which
And
I think it harms the trust the relationship of trust between the student. I think Annette alluded to that earlier.
Well, and I kind of half volunteered for the section on oral exams because I was a little skeptical of the use of oral exams because I've heard from faculty who are like, okay, we can't trust the artifacts, so now we're going to have to go to oral exams. And I had in my head my own PhD dissertation defense, which was a very high stress situation, right? I don't want to inflict that on my students. My advisor was fantastic, but like I brought a lot of stress into that, right? But as I started researching this section of the book, I saw all the literature on oral exams and how to use them in ways that are very humane, that are very supportive, that are aligned with the rest of your course and your learning objectives, that are actually there to help students learn. There's research that shows that when students are preparing for an oral exam, they study in different ways that can be very helpful. Often a 10-minute or 5-minute oral interaction, like Marc was saying, even if it's on Zoom, a face-to-face interaction with one of your students, not to kind of let the entire assessment process ride on that, but to put that in the whole process. I have a colleague at UVA who kind of started off using oral exams as a kind of AI check, and he realized he's teaching an education policy course. The communication around educational policy is actually a learning objective of his. And so he wants to build that in the whole course, not just this thing that gets tacked on at the end to kind of authenticate or surveil students. So he's built in practice for that oral communication throughout the semester. And I think that's a smart approach.
Yeah, I highly agree. And one thing I think we've seen pretty consistently students post-pandemic is that interpersonal professional communication has really fallen down, and more time we can actually encourage students to do this is going to be a skill that is going to follow them in higher education and in their careers too. In fact, that is what we are seeing from industry. They want that level of communication by future graduates. And there are AI tools that can help with that too. We have a lot of our speech faculty practicing with some in Microsoft that are embedded with it too, that can actually have that with I think it's called Speaking Coach. So you can be thoughtful about how you're going to consider that and integrate it. It's not going to be a cure-all though for making your classes AI proof. It is going to be something that if you go to this for trying to secure assessments, it will be very labor intensive. And, in my own discipline of writing, there's not much sort of background about how to use these tools pedagogically, this type of idea of an oral assessment in there. So you have to do what Derek has done too, is really look out and see how this is done in other fields too, and other disciplines. And that's what we try to do with the book, to give these people options to consider that.
Well, Derek, I was going to react to what you said and say I'm really eager to read that chapter on the oral exams. I guess I'll have to wait till July 6th for the Engage event, but I definitely look forward to that. I'm going to take one more question from the Q&A box. This one is by Jennifer Carter, who asked, a few of my friends outside of academia have shared distaste for being asked to use AI, like Claude for coding and drafting for web layouts in the workplace. How can we as mentors help prepare our students to use AI reflectively and effectively in the workplace and in their everyday lives? Who wants to take that question?
Well, I think that it's part of the process of doing this is we are all kind of exposed to this. Derek, Annette, and myself. Annette has a computational background too. She's worked in this field, but Derek and I, generative AI is not something we looked at as part of our lives. And many of our faculty too, and I think people on the actual webinar here today, you're not trained in this. So how do we respond to this? How do we actually deal with it? And the question is, do we even deal with it and actually start preparing for students? I think those are all questions we have to start answering for ourselves. For me, it's all going to be going back down to this question of value, both personal value for students too, to actually see about their own sort of motivations for using these tools or resisting them in some ways. And I think that is something to have us start a conversation about that actually crosses disciplines. And it's not just text, it's not just writing based things. These tools are completely multimodal and have been for 3 or 4 years now. You can put the app on your phone, you can talk with it, you can activate the camera to live stream and look at the actual surrounding world and have it complete different assessment tasks too, or give you live feedback that way. So part of being aware means that you're understanding that these tools are embedded the way they are too, and understanding the use cases, and really just having open communication and dialogue with your students about that. That's the big thing I think we all want right now too. We want students to talk openly to us if they're using these tools. They want us to actually understand it. I need to know if my students are using this to read, to actually go through and study for homework, because I need to know if this is an effective use case. I don't know that if they're not going to be open about that and talk with me. And there's no AI detector to detect if a student's reading or not. That's a big thing.
I think I just want to underscore what Marc is saying about talking to students. Like, this is something that we emphasize throughout the book. We see this from surveys, we see this from, other research that we've done, is that students desperately want to talk to us about AI. And they often, they're navigating this alone. They're getting constantly bombarded with ads for Gemini, from TikTokers, from influencers, things like that. Marc named this a couple of years ago, really influentially. And it's really important for us to understand this context, right? And so I think one of the reasons why we might want to really engage with AI in the classroom is that it gives them a space to do that kind of practice with ethical work in the class, because they're absolutely, almost all of them are using it. So if you introduce it in the class, it's not like you are introducing something new to them, right? What you're doing is giving them a space to kind of engage with it with a kind of scaffolding that could be really important. And I think, there's a lot of different ways that we can run those conversations. If you want to run them anonymously, you can do it in a Google Doc. You can do it, I've used Mentimeter. You can, have little QR codes and students can answer questions. They can do that anonymously. You can have them pass around paper in class. You can have them discuss it openly. We've had Carly Schnitzler at Johns Hopkins and Boston College also has examples of this, using scenarios, specific case scenarios of, is it okay to use AI to do this thing? And have a kind of list of things, and then have students work those things out. And it turns out they have really various ideas about what's okay and what's not okay. And the thing that we see is, we all know these examples of, right, ChatGPT lawyer, or here's using AI for a sympathy thing. These are bad uses of AI, right? But the reason why those things keep getting publicly shamed is that it's all kind of being worked out. Like, we don't have an ethical framework for this that's like really universally shared. And so I think, as we prepare students to move out into the world, wherever they go afterwards, it's like we need them to have that kind of internal ethical orientation that is well thought out and not just a default. So having a space for them to work those things out in a classroom, in community, I think is really crucial.
We're nearing the end here of our hour together, and I know that people like sort of, practical ideas. So for the educators listening at home who are overwhelmed, and I know many people are expressing anxiety here, what is one, and I want to emphasize the next two words, what is one small move they can make in the next class or the next course for it to be more AI aware?
So we actually, I think I actually designed a chapter in this about in-class activities too, around time more than anything else too, because one piece of feedback we've heard from faculty all around the country where we go talk to is that this is so time consuming. So a lot of those activities within that chapter are built around a clock of 10 to 15 minutes if you're in person. They can also be translated into online activities too. Derek did a wonderful job for our online activities chapter as well. But you can take an activity like John Ippolato's What Uses More about AI's environmental impact to bring it in the classroom, pair it with a critical reading about energy usage in AI to get students to start thinking about their own use of generative AI, pair it with how many hours they watch Netflix to see what uses more to begin these sort of critical conversations. And that's the sort of sauce, if you were, too. Something that's active, something that involves a little bit of critical reading or discussion, and then metacognitive reflection, whether that's a written assignment, class-based discussion. And those are some small teachable moments to sort of take a page from Jim Lang that you can actually start incorporating in your life, in your teaching life.
Anyone
I think
else
this
want to
operates
comment
on
on
a
that?
couple of, yeah, it operates on a couple of levels. I think, in our AI aware framework, there's what are your learning goals? How are your students using AI and how do they feel about it? And there can be small ways to open that conversation. Um, I'm a big fan of some form of transparency statement where you ask students to disclose and reflect on their use kind of on one assignment, say. Just take one assignment and have kind of open that box that way. I think also part of it is learning about what AI does and is and how it works. And so I'm a big fan of taking 15 minutes and interacting with a chatbot in some thoughtful way. And I've got to share one concept really quickly that I think is so helpful because it gets back to this kind of mental model of what AI is. And it's the notion of the rubber duck effect. This is a notion from computer programming that if you're working through some computer program and you can't get it to work right, you pick up an inanimate object on your desk like a rubber duck, and you talk your problem out loud to the rubber duck, and it just quacks, right? It doesn't, but the act of articulating your problem helps you see your problem differently and maybe find a solution. And if we see AI as an answer machine, that's not productive. But if we see it as a rubber duck that we can interact with to prompt our own thinking, that's a much more helpful way to approach it. And I think one way we can get started with that is to try to take that approach in kind of our own work, right? I've got a lesson plan coming up next week. Let me talk to a chatbot about some ideas that I might make it more active and kind of see how that conversation goes. And that helps you become more familiar with how these systems work in your own work. And that can prepare you to work with your students as well.
Accepted AI, which is great because this is exactly what the students in my course are doing. And I've been encouraging them to do that, to, articulate their thoughts. Unlike the rubber duck, which only quacks,
Sure,
AI
yeah.
will quack back to you. And
Absolutely.
Okay, there's something really interesting that came up in the chat from June Griffin, not in the Q&A, and it came up actually, or I brought it up during the student panel yesterday. I'm hoping you might comment on faculty using AI to assess and/or give feedback. One of my concerns is that this looks very different across disciplines, and humanists will continue to make student-focused assessment decisions that have them use more time and labor than science and social science faculty.
Well, one of the things we know from students is that they don't want us to use AI feedback. So in terms of like judgment, like they want to hear from us as faculty. I do think that there are ways for us to think about coaching students into using feedback, AI feedback for themselves, so that they're doing that in a good way, and so that it's, all very transparent. One little note I will make about, because we talked about blue books and students' handwriting, is that one way that you can use AI to save labor in humanist classes is, people will say, I can't do that because I can't read my students' writing, is that if you're honest and transparent with your students, you can take pictures of that writing or have them take pictures of that writing and have AI transcribe it. So that is, one of the most simple ways of, integrating AI into assessment that can save labor in those kinds of, writing-based areas.
Yeah.
Derek, you had a surprised face there as I was reading off the question.
I want to hear Marc respond to this, because I think he thinks
That's
a lot
his
about this
surprise
question.
Yeah.
I'm very opposed to using AI to grade, because that is a critical judgment that we are trying to communicate to our students comes from us. And I do think there is a risk of devaluing the relationship that we have between professor and students if we allow AI to do so. I'm perfectly happy with projects like Pair, which Annette mentioned and talked about too, where it's done transparently, it's done above board. But the real fear I have too is that this technology is being sold to faculty in both higher education and also K-12 as a labor-saving tool. And so one of the most labor-intensive things we do is assessment of actual student learning. And having AI not only do that through text-based processes, it can do oral exams. It can look at you live like you're looking at me on this camera right now too, and make judgments about that using an AI system that is opaque and is a black box. You cannot actually ask it how it arrived at its decision. That might change someday, but for right now, it's not going to be appropriate for me. But again, I'm teaching 30 students right now. When I was teaching 125 students, these are different questions you're going to have to ask yourself. But to me, that's the questions we need to be having as departments. We need to start having these sort of open discussions about, hey, if you're using AI to grade, how do you think your students feel about that? How do I feel about that as your colleague, understanding that you're doing that versus me not wanting to do that whatsoever? So those are some big conversations I think this book will hopefully help people start to have.
Derek, anything to add? Very short, because we're running out of time. All right, so then let's end with a very quick round, and I would like each of the three panelists here to complete this sentence. Teaching in an AI-aware way means ...
I would say listening to your students' engagements with AI and calibrating your pedagogy appropriately.
Teaching in an AI-aware way means you're acknowledging that AI teaching is not a solution for AI to solve.
Derek, last but not least.
Teaching in an AI-aware way means helping our students learn how to learn with or without AI.
Annette, Marc, Derek, thank you for this incredible preview of your upcoming book, The Norton Guide to AI-Aware Teaching. I can't wait to see it in print this summer. And a final reminder to our live and virtual audience, do not miss the Perusall Engage event with these three authors later this year. Well, actually, pretty soon, July 6th. You'll be able to read and discuss the book directly with them on the Perusall platform, and you can register at perusall.com/engage. Thank you to everyone at the Perusall Exchange for joining us for this live recording. On behalf of all our listeners, thank you, Annette, Derek, and Marc.
Thank you, Eric. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Yeah, thanks for some great questions and discussion.
Yeah, absolutely.
To find more episodes of Social Learning Amplified, go to perusall.com/social learning amplified, and please subscribe to find out about upcoming episodes. I hope to welcome you back on a future episode.
Social Learning Amplified is sponsored by Perusall, the social learning platform that motivates students by increasing engagement, driving collaboration, and building community through your favorite course content. To learn more, join us at one of our introductory webinars. Visit perusall.com to learn more and register.